how much of this is just up a bit because they were down a lot? Does this 90-day reprieve for some companies really mean anything?
Yeah, I think the 90-day reprieve just kind of opens the door to perhaps more negotiations in this area where otherwise, as of last Wednesday night, that door was really closed. So this is just a little bit of relief after what was a pretty bloody couple of days.
Okay, and Tom, Apple, probably the biggest stock with China exposure that a lot of people understand. And you acknowledge there's China exposure, but you think the selling in Apple is still overdone. Your price target would be 30% upside from here. Why?
So I think what investors are overlooking is Apple's ability to mitigate China-related risk. So you think about on the tariff side, they were able to successfully lobby to have some of their products taken off the list before for tariffs. They could definitely renegotiate new terms with their suppliers to get relief on the tariffs. And to the extent that either Apple can move its assembly out of China longer term or have more products from suppliers who move their efforts out of China, I think that would be another way for them to mitigate tariff risk. When you look at Tim Cook, he's essentially a diplomat. And one of the things he does so well is manage Apple's relation with both the U.S. government and the China government. And I think that's a huge asset that investors are overlooking right now with Apple.
Have you done any modeling work on what it would take to move supply chain out, even if it took a while? How much it would cost? How long it would take?
Specifically for Apple?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely would be a multi-year effort. Oh, I apologize.
Yeah, no problem. I would agree with that. It'd be very, very difficult. I mean, Foxconn is absolutely enormous over there. We're talking campus after campus focused on this particular supply chain, so it would be very difficult.
Yeah, Tom, I'll put the same question to you, especially since I know last month Foxconn said it was going to make investments to maybe do more production of iPhones in India, for example.
Yeah, so I do think it is something that could happen, but I think it would be a matter of more than a year and definitely not quarters. But the question is, what will be the ultimate outcome of the negotiations between the U.S. and China? Will the ultimate outcome really be that all consumer technology products won't be made in China? I think what we'll ultimately see is a trade deal similar to the one that they almost moved forward with, is China agreeing to buy more U.S. products, and then the bigger get would be China to honor intellectual property to a greater extent. So I'm not of the belief, though, that there'll be no deal ultimately.
Chris, how much has this trade war already altered the market dynamic? I was surprised to see estimates that Huawei had stockpiled 12 to maybe even 24 months worth of components to be able to continue production despite this. I hadn't heard that talked about in anybody's earnings calls leading up to this. Couldn't that have huge implications in the amount of buying that's going to happen over the next year or two if they've got that much inventory stockpiled?
Yeah, we wrote about that when we came back from Asia about a month and a half ago. Yeah, we heard up to 2 years stockpiling supply. Even if this ban were to be lifted, the question is how much did they in fact buy ahead? And really, they are buying ahead so that they can build their own chips. These U.S. chips are really a bridge for them to ramp their own technologies. So, it's a pretty complicated world.
But we can say that about all kinds of products that are complex to build. Airplanes, electric vehicles. I mean, how close are they, do you think, to having independent supply chains on chips?
Yeah, I'm specifically talking about 5G base stations and also handset components that are really kind of cutting edge right now. For other applications like defense, aerospace, radiation-hardened chips, these are a little bit more difficult to do and might take them a little bit more time. But in terms of Huawei and communications, they're there.
Wow. Tom, in terms of Apple specifically, the other piece of this, of course, could be cooling consumer demand in China, especially if you get any kind of a call for a boycott, if this trade tension continues. How closely are you watching that, and how big of a risk is that?
So for Apple, China's definitely a double-edged sword. You have the supply chain elements we've been talking about, and then you have a company that generates about 20% of its sales to consumers in China. So I think it is a big risk that you see the Chinese consumer buying essentially in a patriotic manner and not buying U.S. companies products. So it is something we continue to monitor closely. The good news for Apple up until recently, though, is they've been able to get investors to focus more attention on their services business, and that's been a really good story. But again, China remains the big risk for Apple, and it's something we're monitoring closely.
Chris, buttoning this up for us, you say Xilinx, Synaptics, Skyworks, and Qorvo have major Huawei exposure, but how do you assess the risk for the semiconductor space overall if this trade stuff continues to head south? How big is the risk? How much downside from here?
Yeah, and we wrote that note as soon as this came out last week. Qorvo just pre-announced today. It seems as though there's at least a 10% impact for them on the downside from Huawei. And as we sum this all up for the overall total semiconductor industry here, we're probably talking at least $10 billion worth of U.S. semiconductors that are going to be affected here going into Huawei.